It started with a whisper, a rumor that drifted along the long corridors of the Metropolitan Archive in London. A forgotten collection, dust-laden and unremarkable at first glance, had been donated from the estate of Edmund Harrington, a name that had once meant something in Edwardian photography but had long since faded into obscurity. Among portraits of society faces and stiffly posed families was a single image, yellowed at the edges, its weight heavier than its modest paper might suggest. A boy no older than 5 stood within it, frozen forever in the light of June 17th, 1908. His hair was carefully combed, parted evenly, as though set there by a meticulous hand. His sailor suit, the uniform of wealth for children in those years, was spotless. His shoes gleamed as though only recently polished. But it was not the correctness of the image that silenced the archivists. It was the train cradled carefully in the boy's small hands, gleaming in miniature with an unnatural presence for something meant only to amuse a child. The photographs. Journey carried it onto the desk of Dr. Eleanor Blackwood on a rain-dark Tuesday in April, more than a century later. As the Metropolitan Archive's lead curator of photographic restoration, she had seen far too many such relics, each frozen family memory already stripped hollow by time. Yet something about this particular image caused her hand to still mid-gesture. As she reached for the protective gloves she always wore, there was weight here. Stillness, yes, but not absence. The paper seemed to resist silence. Her assistant Marcus placed it down without ceremony, muttering something about it being another addition to the Edwardian file. But Eleanor lowered the lamp with deliberate care, her eyes narrowing at the sharpness unusually present in its surface. The image should have resembled all others, slightly blurred, softened by emulsions that aged poorly. Instead, the detail struck her as unsettling. The wallpaper behind the boy displayed an intricate pattern of trains and carriages. The polished floor shone beneath a flood of light from tall, curtained windows. Each embellishment spoke of money and care. A rocking horse stood to the left, locked in perpetual mid-stride, mane plastered in an eternal arc. A shelf of neat books and toys stood to the right, arranged so carefully it betrayed more the skill of servants than the play of children, in that austere perfection. The boy appeared both cherished and curated. Yet his expression did not fit the stage set around him. Portraits of children from that decade yielded predictable faces, a practiced smile, a nervous stiffness, occasionally the startled glare of young ones, unused to cameras. But not this child. His eyes were not vacant, nor playful. They were fixed with an unsettling directness, dark and oddly solemn, as though they carried memories no child could possibly hold. Each time Eleanor looked closer, she felt her pulse shift, reading, not innocence, but severity in the quiet curve of his lips and the depth behind the gaze. The toy was no less baffling. All across Europe, at that moment in time, toy makers were perfecting pocket locomotives, prized by wealthy parents. But what lay in Thomas Harrington's hands was unlike anything in her research. The brasswork shone with sharp angles, the miniature fittings tailored so carefully they bordered on engineering diagrams rather than playful design. Streamlined casing curled where no locomotive of 1908 had yet carried such features. The cowcatcher framing its front was out of place for Britain entirely, borrowed from across the Atlantic. Eleanor forced her eyes to scan reference books at her elbow, one by one, but no name matched, no design mirrored. The toy was impossible. Thomas Harrington. Marcus recited, in his usual distracted way, flipping through accession notes. Son of Edmund. Likely the subject in front of the lens. She let the name linger, repeating it softly. It clung to the image. Thomas Harrington, she said again, and then, fainter, to no one. What became of you? Day after day, Eleanor returned to the photograph, each time finding another sliver of unease caught within that flat surface. Colleagues teased her gently for her obsession, but she could not resist. There was a hook in it. She inspected the polished floor, the line, of the toy's wheels, the rocking horse's stiff poise. Always, her eyes returned to the boy's gaze. One night, after all had gone home, she placed it carefully into the scanner to capture it again. The quiet of the archive swallowed her as the hum of equipment filled the room. She tapped unconsciously against the desk in rhythms taught to her by her mother on the piano. The file enlarged upon her screen under the lamplight's glow. She traced the wallpaper, the books, the curtains. Nothing more than expected. Then she magnified the boy's small face once more. His eyes opened wider as the image expanded. Reflected within those black mirrors of children's pupils lay shapes faint but persistent. She identified the obvious first. Edmund Harrington, caught ghost-like in his son's eyes as he leaned behind the bulky early camera. But then, something else. A tall outline beside him, undefined, stretched somehow beyond natural proportion. Its shoulders inclined wrongly, its height overbearing for the space. For a still image more than a century old, it was startlingly clear. Something was in the room with Thomas as the shutter opened. Eleanor sat back, the shadows stretching long across her office. "What on earth?" she whispered aloud, her voice brittle in the silence. Long after midnight she walked, beneath London air, rain still glossing the streets, muffled buses roaring in the distance. The photograph, locked again in its protective sleeve, seared behind her eyes. And as she reached the glimmer of the underground station lights, she thought, just faint, just impossible that she heard the lonely cry of a whistle roll along streets where no train should ever run. The days after, Eleanor's first encounter with the photograph blurred into a rhythm. She had not lived since her doctoral years, long hours bending over texts, nights swallowed by a fascination she could not fully admit to colleagues. The boy with the train had ceased to be an archival curiosity. He had become a presence, his grave expression haunting her sleep, his toy gleaming in her mind's eye each time she looked away. Every historian begins with context. She dug back into the Harrington file, assembling Edmund's footprint in London society. Between 1900 and 1912, he had been a noted figure. Columns in society pages mentioned his Bond Street studio, praised his ability to capture more than superficial likeness. His clients, drawn from titled families and wealthy merchants, left dozens of frames behind. Each bore Edmund's careful mark in the lower corner, and each shared the same quality: detail close to life, haunting in clarity. His wife, Margaret, had been no less prominent, the daughter of northern mill owners, heiress to textile fortunes. She had died in 1903, giving birth to Thomas. It explained the preoccupation in Edmund's surviving commentary, the obsessive documentation of his only child. Yet what halted Eleanor was not Edmund's prestige, it was gaps. In the piles of his carefully catalogued prints, the family album should have contained dozens more shots of his son. Instead, there were only 3 known. The nursery portrait of 1908, an earlier image of Thomas as a toddler, indistinct, and then silence. Missing negatives, missing proofs. If Edmund truly adored his child, why only fragments? Marcus fetched her supplementary folders. One contained clippings of Edmund's later life, his withdrawal from society functions, the studio closing its doors by 1915, whispers of bankruptcy. By the early 1920s, he was reported chasing rumors on the continent, sightings of something, though the articles never clarified what. In 1923, he was recorded as dead, his fortune gone, his name dimmed. Placed against his son's mysterious vanishing, the timeline darkened. For in September of 1909, the Daily Telegraph carried a small entry: prominent photographer's son missing, police baffled. Eleanor pressed both clippings flat. Her eyes lingered. The article recounted that Thomas had been put to bed by his nursemaid at 9 o'clock. Nothing unusual, no disturbance. By dawn, he was gone. No broken window, no disturbed locks, no ransom. A boy disappeared into thin air, The clock in her office ticked, and the lamp hummed like low voltage. Over and over she whispered the words to herself, "Gone by morning." The police conclusion at the time was cruelly perfunctory. The boy had wandered, perhaps slipped into the river, lost unrecorded. Warren's offers ended in silence. To the public, it became another half-remembered story. To Edmund, it became obsession. Eleanor found his letters next, thin, spidery handwriting, across yellow paper. At first practical, begging informants for any rumor of a child seen wandering, then stranger. Notes to friends about interested parties, warnings that some stood in the garden at night. The latest, dated 1912, ended in desperation. Between them, one shallow sentence chilled Eleanor most. He writes, "Thomas told me he will leave with the conductor at midnight." That name refused to let her rest. The conductor, always capitalized, no explanation. She turned pages once more, and each mention deepened the shadow. She stood finally and went back to the photograph. Magnified again, Thomas's eyes reflected the ghostly figure she had gleaned late before, beside his father's camera stance, elongated and indistinct, a second presence. She pulled her scarf tighter around her shoulders despite the warmth. The following afternoon she showed the image to David Chen, a digital imaging specialist, his fingers quick over keyboard shortcuts designed for astronomical imaging. He turned to her after 20 minutes of silence. "Artifacts are easy to spot, but this is not. This shape exists in light and shadow." It was there. When he enhanced the toy itself, the train's details sharpened almost beyond belief. Wheels aligned awkwardly, designs layered from different decades. When Eleanor cross-checked with period engines, there was nothing. The Flying Scotsman had entered service, but was a dark green machine of another form. No British locomotive resembled the toy's casing. Some American engines bore similar features, but not all. The toys seemed to draw on different sources of design, some yet to come. David leaned back in his chair. "You'd think someone built this with knowledge from the future." He laughed softly after he said it, but not with conviction. That night, Eleanor found herself outside late, clouds heavy over the Thames. In the distance, a sound played in her ears, a low whistle, stretched, mournful. She told herself it was a train on the line at King's Cross, though the hour was past 3, and yet she did not look away from the dark, as though some blue-lit carriage might be gliding silently past in the mist. The Cornish coast was drowned in grey fog. When Eleanor stepped off the train, salt clung in the air, seeping into her throat, the temps of the Atlantic reminding her how far from the archive's neat London order she had come. The curator of the St. Ives Maritime Museum met her at the gate, an elderly man with a weather-beaten face named Henry Trelawney. His accent rolled like the sea as he ushered her toward a climate-controlled room. He spoke with surprising excitement for someone ostensibly showing a faded photograph. "It came to us decades ago in a bequest from the Penrose estate. You'll know the name. They owned the land just inland and a private station along the line." He placed the board on the green felt table and slid a protective sleeve aside. Eleanor leaned in, and the fog in her chest grew heavier. The boy stared back at her again. Thomas Harrington, or someone who could only be him, stood clearly on a railway platform, his small hands clutching that same impossible train. Yet this was not June 1908. The back of the photograph bore an inscription in pencil. December 21st, 1909. He was meant to have been missing for over 3 months by then. Mourned, presumed lost forever. And here he was, his body thinner, his cheeks hollower, a shadow of childhood ironed from his features. His smile had disappeared into something solemn, eyes wide. Strangely adult. Behind him stretched the wooden platform of Penrose's private station. The sign only partly visible, with the letters pen still stamped in weathered paint, snow-dusted. The boards, a winter unfamiliar to the polished nursery light of the earlier image. Most shocking, Half veiled in the pale mist at the photograph's right edge was a curved nose of a full-sized locomotive, its paint too dark for black and white alone to explain. The sheen caught the light differently than surrounding textures. Eleanor knew what she saw. The impossible machine rendered real. The same angles and casing sketched into the toy were presented now as iron. "Your eyes do not deceive you," Henry said quietly, as though reading her mind. "There are stories down here. We call it the Penrose train. People said they saw it glide past at night. No driver, no smoke, just light. My grandfather swore he looked up through the hedgerows once and saw at one of the windows a small boy's solemn face." Eleanor's gloved hand hovered just above the boy in the photograph. And the Penrose family. Strange people, Lord William especially, obsessed with invention, fascinated beyond reason with new transport. Spoke of powers embedded in rails no one else could perceive. Then, in 1912, during a stormy night, he vanished. Was said to be in his workshop beside the line, claimed he was on the cusp of unveiling something. He never reappeared. Drownings and disappearances, the family line tampered with by scandal. Eleanor stared harder at Thomas. Differences leaped into painful clarity. He no longer wore the sailor suit. Instead, his jacket had sharp lapels, not belonging to any Edwardian children's fashion book she had studied. The cut was like a collage of eras, pieces spliced together like the train's design itself. His neck revealed a faint glimmer. When she adjusted her magnifier, a chain was visible resting against his collar. A pocket watch, perhaps, absurd, in the hands of a child. And there, faint within the image's far frame once again, rose what she dreaded to confirm, a shadow, elongated, so tall its presence bent perspective, proportions blurred and unnatural. The same outline she had seen reflected in his pupils from the nursery photo. Not a ghost story. "Dr. Blackwood," Henry rasped. "It has repeated too long to dismiss. That train did not belong to any company, and the boy who appeared with it did not belong to our time." She carried the high-resolution copy back toward London the following day. Her train rattled under cold skies, the window misted with condensation. She pressed her finger unconsciously to the glass and imagined another track running parallel beyond fields and hedges, where silent wheels glided blue, lit against frost. And she wondered not if Thomas had been taken, but where he had gone. When she returned to the archive, she pinned the Cornwall copy beside the nursery portrait. 1908, the polished room. 1909, the winter platform. Same boy, different world. Between them, the impossible locomotive grew from toy to physical form. The shadow grew too, sharpening its outlines, keeping pace. She could not yet articulate what she saw spread across her wall. History repeating wrong, bending forward. And in the center, binding toy and engine and apparition, the wide, unwavering stare of a child who seemed to know more than she ever dared learn. The Scottish photograph arrived, folded within an envelope, so ordinary that Eleanor nearly dismissed it. Marcus had been hunting obsessively through local newspaper archives, and one of his queries had finally yielded something from Ennis, a rural town north of Edinburgh. He laid it down on her desk, with an excitement rare for his shy frame. She slid the image free and felt the air drain from the room. Thomas again, older now, though scarcely more than 2 years could have passed since June 1908. Yet everything in his features spoke of years that should not have yet been lived. His cheeks sharper, his gaze deeper, haunted, and still in both hands he clutched that miniature train as though it were less a toy and more a lifeline. Behind him stretched the stone platform of Inness station, flags strung above for the opening ceremony. Townsfolk gathered in hats and coats formed a blurred background. But it was what loomed beside him that turned Eleanor's breath shallow. A locomotive filled the frame. Not a stock engine of the London and Northeastern Railway. Not any model documented in volumes she had cross-checked countless nights. This was the toy rendered at impossible scale. Angled casing hugging its drive wheels, brass cowcatcher jutting forward. A streamlined spine that would not officially appear in any country until decades after the date scrawled on the caption, May 5, 1910. The blue and gold gleam was lost in grayscale, but somehow its metallic shimmer still pressed through the grain, a color echo trapped in silver salts. She traced the boiler lines with her magnifying glass and felt an irrational chill, as though the metal in her hands might hum. Marcus hovered. "It can't exist," he murmured. "Even I can see that." When she showed the print to Wells, the railway historian, his jocular air was gone. He flipped quickly through his ledgers and diagrams before slamming the books shut. His spectacles caught the lamplight as he muttered, "This isn't engineering speculation. This is knowledge. Whoever built this had designs that weren't conceived until long after. If you are telling me this photograph is authentic, then history itself is bent here." Eleanor said nothing, her fingers still locked on the pocket watch. Now visible dangling clearly against Thomas's chest, the chain looped down from his collar. Under magnification the casing caught gleams of etched detail. She could not yet make out the full inscription, but the impression was their words pressed from a time that had not yet arrived. And in the far corner once again, a shape towered just beyond the station canopy, blurred, elongated, suggestion, enough to send a tingle up her arms. Always present, always at the edge. The conductor, watching still. By now, Eleanor's office wall stretched with pinned images. Captions marked in red ink, 1908, 1909, 1910, child, toy, train. Side by side, the sequence looked less like history and more like a progression in stages of metamorphosis. What began as a simple nursery trick had grown into an engine that did not belong to any known timetable. And Thomas, in each image, his small body had shifted further from innocence. The smile of the first had gone. The solemn mask of the second had deepened. The third showed a boy whose eyes belonged to a man decades older, eyes that glared from the frame with warning or appeal. Wells drew his hand down his face and croaked, "This isn't just a child lost. This is either the greatest forgery in the history of photography, or the most important evidence of phenomena we cannot begin to name." Eleanor barely heard him across the wall. The boy's gaze seemed to shift toward her, a century collapsing. That night when she switched off the light and stepped onto London Street, she swore she heard steel wheels rolling somewhere under the earth, unmarked on any map, still carrying their solemn cargo forward. Eleanor's research was no longer confined to photographs stacked on her desk, which she had pinned across her Walla nursery, a snow-dusted private platform. A Scottish inauguration had shifted from curiosity into obsession. Even in the short spaces between duties, she found herself drifting back, eyes drawn to Thomas's hollowing stare. Every archivist knows when they've crossed the line between cataloging and chasing. Eleanor had crossed it fully. Marcus noticed too. He found her one midnight seated rigid at her desk, the lamp haloed around the Scottish photo. In her hands lay journals, their paper browned with age, borrowed from Harrington's estate collection. It was there she found passages, scarcely legible, that deepened the dread. Edmund's script grew erratic by midsummer. 1909. He wrote of strangers at the hedge-line after dusk, and of Thomas speaking at night in voices not his own. One note read simply, "He insists the conductor meets him at the window." The word was capitalized always, never explained. The conductor by September, the day before Thomas's disappearance. Edmund had written a last frantic note. He woke in screams, held the toy out in warning, said, "At midnight, he comes to take me away. He calls it a journey." Eleanor's fingertips lingered over that line, while cold built at the back of her neck. Next morning, she invited David Chen again to apply filters, not merely to Thomas's coat or watch, but to the background of the nursery shot. Magnified and sharpened, what they found was more grotesque in its subtlety, Behind the curtains, faint lines of symmetry blurred like the shadow of a figure, standing pressed against glass, limbs long, head angled unnaturally. David exhaled softly and whispered, "That isn't camera noise. That was there." For days Eleanor felt watched even outside the archive. Crossing Blackfriars Bridge one rain-slicked night, she heard a drawn-out whistle curl out of fog though. No listed trains ran that hour. Once, at the edge of her vision, she swore she saw a thin silhouette standing at the lip of a street lamp's arc, unmoving. When she turned fully, the pavement was empty. Newspapers of the era gave her further ground. In late 1909, months after Thomas vanished, families across Cornwall had whispered about a boy with a toy staring from a train window when an unmarked locomotive rushed silently down private tracks connected to the Penrose estate. The same words repeated in clippings. Blue steam, brassy light, no sound. Lord Penrose's name rose everywhere now. Wealthy industrialist, eccentric, frequently photographed among politicians. Then suddenly absent after 1912. His obsession with rail technology had driven him to build workshops on his estate, where experiments with engines and generators were said to rattle windows at night. The same autumn he disappeared. Villagers noted unearthly lights glowing above the hedgerows where no track should gleam. A steward had once quoted him cryptically, "The rails are only part of the ladder. They can run forward as well as across." When Eleanor unearthed that stray remark, her heart pounded. By now the pattern unfurled coldly. A boy disappears into thin air in 1909. Last words, naming a conductor. Months later, his image surfaces at Penrose's private station, older, always with the toy. A year later he is seen again in Scotland, standing beside a full engine matching the impossible miniature. Penrose, meanwhile, vanishes into his workshop during a storm in 1912, and is never seen again. In clipped rural registers, villagers whisper of a shining phantom train, silent wheels, and in one window a small, solemn face carrying something gleaming. What had begun as a routine photograph had expanded into conspiracy, gnawing at the edges of recorded time. And Eleanor knew with cold certainty that she was now following tracks that did not end in archive boxes, but ran forward under her feet, towards something still moving through the dark. By the time Eleanor spread the 3 photographs across her desk, 1908 in the nursery, 1909 on that snow-dust platform in Cornwall, 1910 in Scotland, she no longer thought of them as isolated artifacts. Together they read like the chapters of a book she was only beginning to understand. And threaded through each chapter was the same impossible thread. Thomas Harrington aging too quickly, clutching the same anachronistic train, enshadowed always by a figure no one wished to name but which Edmund himself had already called in his frantic scrawl. The conductor. Her search widened to institutions beyond Britain. In the basement records of the Society for Psychical Research, she found testimonies curiously aligned. They dated to 1913, 4 years after Thomas's disappearance. Railwaymen from York to Edinburgh described a strange blue and gold locomotive, gliding into stations unscheduled, noiseless. Guards made note that the ground beneath them never shook as it should when engines thunder past. Some claimed they saw sparks glowing around the wheels, like trailing cold fire. But the most disturbing were the personal recollections, written in careful longhand. A signalman in Durham, *. He looked out the window of the first car. A boy, dark hair, eyes too grave. In his lap, a toy engine, and behind him, another shape, tall, like an adult, but not of ordinary proportion. A porter, in Aberdeen, *. Its face kept staring. But all the while, the train moved with no driver aboard. *. None of these accounts had made it into national press. They were filed instead here, politely dismissed, labeled anomalies. Eleanor knew with creeping certainty they were echoes of the same story she now followed. When she added their dates to her growing wall timeline, the air in her room seemed to thicken. 1908, 1909, 1910. In 1913, the ghost sightings, circling like ripples widening outward from the first stone. And in 1912, the Penrose Storm Night disappearance neatly lodged between them. The pattern did not break. It reinforced itself. Marcus entered quietly, his usual fumbling sheepishness now replaced with unease of his own. He carried a small box of Penrose's estate papers, unsigned notes donated long after his disappearance. Among them, scraps speaking of experiments with power sources, sketches of rails intersecting at unnatural angles, cryptic words such as the aperture, frequency windows, asterisk, passenger vessel, asterisk. Eleanor held the pages delicately, chilled by how they resembled not the eccentric doodles of an aging lord, but the blueprints of someone who had glimpsed technologies yet unborn. When she closed the folders that night, London outside had quieted, under fog again. The great clock towers told their late hours. Across the stone of the archive walls she thought she felt a vibration travel, not from traffic, not from wind, but something running deep, like wheels rolling on hidden iron. She crossed to the window, pressed her palm to the cold glass, and out beyond the mist, thought she caught the faintest shimmer of bluish light drawing swiftly and silently across the dark. The sensation that followed was not terror, but inevitability. If Thomas had been taken aboard, if Penrose had followed after him, then perhaps this line they vanished onto was not severed by the years. Perhaps it still ran, weaving under nights, waiting to cross her path next. Eleanor's wall of clippings and pinned photographs had grown into something closer to a conspiracy map. 3 images of Thomas were centered like icons: the polished nursery, the wintry platform, the Scottish station. Around them she had circled dates from testimonies, Penrose's estates, and now, in thick red ink, 1912, Penrose vanishes. The man had been wealthy, eccentric, and dangerously curious. His estate papers hinted at experiments with energy, frequency, and rail alignments. His staff whispered of late-night hammering and flashes of unnatural light escaping the cracks of his workshop walls. The year he disappeared, Cornwall endured one of the fiercest autumn storms in memory. Servants said Penrose had dismissed them early that night, insisting he had a final window to step through with his inventions. He was never seen again. But Eleanor discovered more in the minor press. A gardener reported seeing a carriage-sized glow linger by the workshop before being swallowed by cliffs. A local paper described blue sheets of static across the Penrose rails, the words treated half as satire. Then silence, save for gossip. Lord Penrose was eccentric, overwhelmed, perhaps a suicide. The estate passed on, his name faded. In the quieter notes of hidden repositories, Eleanor found differently. A solicitor's file from 1913 revealed Penrose had prepared letters. Most were ordinary divesting assets, codicils for family members. Yet one was sealed with unusual instructions. It was not to be opened unless the blue train returns. Its wording chilled her. It suggested Penrose himself either vanished aboard, or else believed he soon would. David Chen joined her one evening as she cross-checked these fragments against the new data Marcus had unearthed. Together, they enlarged the Scottish rail photograph once more. Marks along the train's casing were clearer this time. Rivet patterns, joint seams. David frowned. These aren't fantasy doodles. They reflect engineering methods advanced at least 20 years. This is retrofitted knowledge. Someone had to know design features from a future they shouldn't have seen. Eleanor pressed her palm against the photograph. Penrose, she breathed. The implication widened the room around her. Edmund had watched his son vanish into the night, and years later, Penrose followed. Whether willingly or under escort, they were taken aboard the same impossible line. She turned to the last photographs again. Thomas stared across the aegis, toy rail cradled like fate, and beside him in glass, in shadow, in whispered testimony V. Conductor watched forever. What unsettled Eleanor most was no longer whether it was real, but how much longer it would wait before calling her to the discovery that Penrose's name resurfaced years after his supposed disappearance struck Eleanor like a thunderclap. Marcus had been combing European patent archives when he appeared in her office, flushed with urgency. "You need to see this," he said, wincing as though the papers themselves might burn. Across brittle sheets dated from the early 1930s were patent applications under a Germanized name, Wilhelm Perlman. At first the claims seemed arcane, theoretical mechanics, but as Eleanor paced through them, her heart thudded louder. Designs for bearings eerily similar to those fitted in high-speed engines, decades later, streamlined casings whose principles wouldn't be pioneered officially until long after the Second World War, energy couplers suggesting technologies from an age yet to arrive. She turned the pages faster, bile rising with awe. If Penrose had reinvented himself abroad, the eccentric aristocrat had transformed into something entirely different. A man engineering tomorrow, from whispers torn out of their own time. Days later, an envelope arrived from a Swiss archive, she had queried. It contained a photograph from a 1932 engineering conference. The caption named the enthusiastic figure at center as Professor Wilhelm Perlman, but Eleanor's hand trembled as she traced his jawline, because she knew it instantly. William Penrose, older, hair, gray, thicker at the waist. But those same penetrative eyes and sharpened cheekbones. And there in the photograph, standing at his side, small face, half turned to the camera, was a boy who looked unchanged from the Scottish picture more than 20 years earlier. Thomas Harrington. His hands rested not on the toy this time, but pressed against the table, where a scale model of that impossible train gleamed in miniature. The breath left her lungs. She leaned closer still and saw another detail strung on Penrose's vest, a heavy chain ending in a pocket watch. Its gleam unmistakable, the same artifact Thomas had worn around his neck, and the blurred edge of the conference hall, beneath banners readers might not notice. A tall blur of silhouette appeared partially in frame, a distortion, too familiar, long, thin, inhumanly proportioned. The conductor had followed into the 1930s. That photograph did not collapse Eleanor's theories. It detonated them into a reality she could no longer step back from. This was no longer a child gone astray, no longer a nobleman lost in storm. This was an alliance witnessed across decades. Penrose Perlman stood as a man feeding future, technology into present day, and always, beside him, the boy with the toy train, unaged, unwavering, passenger two forces vast and unseen. Eleanor sat alone in the archive that night, cicadas of panic buzzing through her ribs. If the train could leap from 1909 to 1932, there was no telling when it might call again. The timeline she had traced was no arc of grief. It was a railway itself, steel lines hammered from future to past, driven not by coal fires, but by something far older, colder, and still conducting. Eleanor felt a dangerous certainty settle over her. The train was not folklore or metaphor. It was moving along history like a shadow tied to catastrophe, unveiling itself just long enough for witnesses to gasp before vanishing. Again, she combed deeper through railway bulletins, police anomalies, newspaper scraps. Patterns emerged. In 1938, weeks before the Munich Agreement, railway workers on the outskirts of Berlin swore they saw an unlisted engine racing silently through a freight yard at midnight, glowing faintly. Several recorded that a boy stared from its first window, as though waiting to be seen. In 1962, during the hair-trigger week of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a signal operator in Yorkshire jotted a note he never published. Asterisk phantom locomotive, silent wheels, blue shimmer. Boy with serious eyes asterisk. The following day, his supervisors dismissed it as fatigue. And then came 1986. A report folded deep within. A Ukrainian local paper told of engineers near Pripyat who caught sight of an unscheduled engine drifting along an abandoned spur line, days before the reactor at Chernobyl tore itself apart. The voices converged on the same imagery: a child standing at the window, only partially lit, toy pressed to his chest. Beside him, a man older, distinguished, unbowed by time, and in another seat or passageway, a silhouette the human mind tried to ignore, stretched, oddly proportioned, presence bending the camera of memory. These sightings, decades apart, were plotted across Eleanor's growing wall. Thread after thread knotted the images together, always before political upheaval, before calamity, before epochal shifts. To the public, these were oddities, whispered away. To her, they were the faint sound of an approaching whistle, looping through time. She reread Penrose's 1912 note again and again. He had hinted at something larger than himself, *, all possible futures narrowing to a single path. It no longer read as mania, but as warning. The patents under the name Perlman, the conferences, the photographs all confirmed he had carried back knowledge to reshape the technology of his era. And Thomas, no older in 1932 than in 1910, seemed carried through unchanged, entrusted with some enigmatic role. Each time Eleanor passed the pinned photographs, she felt not triumph, but inevitability. This was not study. It was a summons laid a century before her birth. The conductor had been glimpsed across generations, and now, she realized, perhaps it was only a matter of time. History, sliding toward a scheduled stop before his shadow, stepped close enough to her own reflection. Eleanor wondered, at last, if she still had control over the pursuit. It no longer felt like she was studying Thomas Harrington so much as being drawn after him down tracks she could neither veer from, nor slow. Patterns and ripples hardened into something sharper, deliberate, like the rails themselves had been laid. Long before she set foot on them, Marcus arrived one evening with a worn parcel, contents from a solicitor, connected to the Penrose estate. Inside was the envelope she had read about, sealed for over a century with an injunction that it be opened only when the blue train returns. With trembling hands, Eleanor unfolded the paper under the lamp's cone of light. The handwriting was in William Penrose's confident, slanted hand. *, if you are reading this, then you have followed the signals laid in photographs and memories. The child, Thomas, was chosen. Not by me, but by those he called the conductors. They stand at windows we cannot see. They move along rails we never laid. They placed gifts in our world, the toy engine, the watch fragments to anchor him, and us between paths. With those gifts I built my entrances, my versions of the train, and the door opened. I stepped aboard. I have seen futures I was never meant to see. Some terrible, some wondrous. Our purpose, they say, is to keep the line from derailing entirely. *, Eleanor read the words again and again, each glance tightening her skin. Penrose claimed not invention, but invitation. His notes spoke of adjustments across centuries, nudges before wars, interventions shadowing plagues. He described Thomas not as victim, but as passenger, an emissary small enough to pass between times. By the bottom of the page, Penrose confessed weariness. *, the line is endless. I fear the day when all recessions of track come together as one. The point of convergence will not be mine to hold. It will be yours. Whoever finds these words, know you were chosen, too. *, her fist clenched around the page, until the crackle of ancient paper nearly split. This was no longer research. This was a summons written directly to her, a century prior. Later that week, on her desk, she stared at the photograph of Thomas in his nursery. The figure in the reflection was clearer now than she remembered. She wondered uneasily if the archive scan had altered each time she looked, as if the negatives themselves refused to hold still. The watch around Thomas's neck gleamed under the magnifier, enhanced further, faint etching shimmered, WP 1932, the past is prologue. Her heart thudded violently. William Penrose, the exact year of his conference in Switzerland, decades ahead of the photograph. The words were an intrusion from the future into the past, inscribed on the boy's chain before either event had happened. It was an object out of time, a message across the tracks, and it had waited for her. Eleanor began living in two worlds, one where she still performed the duties expected of her as head curator, and another, larger, one where every waking thought orbited those three photographs and the letter's unsettling command. She caught herself staring too long at blank walls, waiting for sound, for vibration, as though at any moment wheels might pass beneath her feet. It was in that suspended state of mind that an email arrived from the National Archives European desk, a scanned photograph from Switzerland, 1932. She already knew what she would see before she opened the file. There stood William Penrose, under his adopted name, Perlman, smiling in a conference hall crowded with engineers. Age lined his jaw, but he looked vigorous still. On the table in front of him gleamed a scale model, its lines unmistakable. The blue and gold casing, the streamlined armor around its wheels, the two American cowcatcher grafted onto its nose. The impossible train no railway had claimed. A toy thrust forward into true machine and represented yet again as a model under the guise of design. She zoomed deeper and nearly cried out. To Penrose's right, a boy posed beside the display, thin as a reed, hollow-eyed but utterly unchanged. Hair neat, gaze piercing. Thomas Harrington, looking no older than the boy who had stared from the nursery in 1908, from the Penrose line in 1909, from the Enos platform in 1910, not aged a day in 22 years. In one hand there it was, the original toy engine, still clutched, scaled down against the model's shinier mock-up. Train following train, spiraling back into itself, and further yet, blurred, where shadows fell against conference decor. Yes, there was the shape again. Long, wrong, taller than the men straining to see around it. The conductor, captured inadvertently by another man's lens, as if it wished Eleanor never to forget who directed the line. She sat with the image for hours, until her limbs numbed. It was not exhilaration, but recognition flooding her. Penrose had stepped aboard and returned reshaped, spreading knowledge from another line of time. Thomas had been preserved in perpetual passage, emissary, tethered between tracks, and wherever they traveled, the conductor followed, tall and inevitable, steering everything toward convergence. When the archive lights dimmed that night, Eleanor remained frozen before the glowing monitor. Every instinct screamed that something was coming. Closer, that she was no longer documenting history, but entering it. The boy's eyes, across a century, seemed trained not on the cameras of then, but on her, silently preparing her for the whistle she would one day hear. The days that followed felt less like routine, and more like waiting at a station for a delayed train you could not see but knew was coming. Eleanor moved through the archive with her colleagues, answering questions, attending meetings. Yet every sound beyond her office made her heart pause. Footsteps in the corridor, the electrical groan of the building's antiquated wiring, the sudden click of metal against stone. It all felt like signals, as if the unseen timetable was already unfolding around her. She mapped it obsessively. 1908, nursery. 1909, Penrose's private line. 1910, Enos station. 1912, Penrose's own disappearance. 1913, reports documented by the Society for Psychical Research. 1932, Switzerland, Penrose reborn as Perlman, with Thomas still at his side. 1938, Munich. 1962, the missile crisis. 1986, Pripyat. Each sighting of the impossible blue and gold engine placed like a waypoint on a far larger track, and always before calamity. That was the detail that kept her awake at night. Each appearance came at the lip of historical collapse, as though the train ran parallel to catastrophe. Skirting along turning points the way a careful driver rides brakes along a bend, the consistency was chilling. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was intervention. In her private notes, she stopped calling the figure the shadow, and began writing it plainly, the conductor. She had resisted the word, but by now, avoiding it felt childish. It was the only name Edmund had left, the only one that echoed through testimony. The conductor was real, even if its proportions bent every rule of the human eye. One sleepless dawn, tired of pacing, she returned to the scanned image of Thomas's watch. Enhanced further, she made out the etching more fully, WP 1932. The past is prologue. William Penrose's initials, carved decades before into an object photographed around the boy's throat in 1910. The loop was complete. Time did not trickle forward here. It folded in on itself. That morning, she knew with a clarity as sharp as pain that she was not tracing curiosities anymore. She was following tracks already set, rails leading her step by step closer to their next stop. The conductor had been glimpsed at windows and in glass for over a century. Perhaps, she realized, it had been waiting not for Penrose, not for Thomas, but for her. When the bell of the archive chimed the hour, its sound was nearly drowned beneath a phantom whistle that seemed to tremble against her heart. By now, Eleanor no longer told herself she was building a historical case. The archive wall with its photographs, clippings, chartered sightings, and annotated maps looked less like research and far more like a timetable. Every line of red twine she'd strung pinned events like stations, and the train silent, blue lit. Impossible was running right on schedule. It wasn't only the documents anymore. She felt it around her. The vibration through the stone floors when no lorry passed outside. The inexplicable metallic temps in the air of her office, as though coal and oil fumes had seeped out of paper and ink. Twice that week she caught colleagues, staring at her wall and stepping back nervously, as if the photographs themselves pressed too heavy upon them. The final confirmation came with a letter opened under strict permission from the solicitor's archive, dated September 1st, 1912, the day before Penrose disappeared into the storm. The words were sharp, hurried, his nerve collapsing under awe. Thomas has shown me truths our years should never have contained. The conductors wait beyond glass. They know what lies ahead. The model was their gift, the watch their key. Tomorrow at midnight, the line will open. I will step aboard. If this is read by another, then you two have been called to answer their signal. This is not journey, but duty. Eleanor closed the brittle page, her hands tingling. It was a summoning across time, her, by name. Not possible, yet not deniable. The next evening, she lingered long after the last assistants had left. The nursery portrait of Thomas lay lit on her desk by the Englepoise lamp. She leaned close to his face, pupils dark as wells. For an instant, she thought she saw them flicker, and in their black mirrors, the faint gleam of something metallic behind her shoulder. She spun in her chair. Nothing, only the shelves and the dim corridor. Her computer hummed, screensaver pulsing. She reset the archival scan at maximum resolution one final time. Across the grain of the image, across paper over a century old, new marks revealed themselves on the body of the toy, engraved finer than any scale could justify, were numbers 1706, 1908, the very date captured on the back of the photograph. Impossible, documented in the photograph itself, a machine marked with its own origin. She shut her eyes, afraid and exultant at once. The rails underneath London were silent that night, but deep down she knew this was calm before the next arrival. Somewhere in that endless dark, the whistle was already calling. The boy, no older, no younger, with his steadfast train. The conductor, with its hollow patience. And perhaps, this time, They had come not only to be recorded, but to collect another passenger. Some photographs capture a moment. This one captured a mystery that refused to stay buried. A boy in 1908, clutching an impossible toy. A father who watched him vanish. A nobleman who stepped onto rails, no map contained, and a century of whispered sightings of a train that was never built. Each time it appeared, history bent, catastrophe loomed, and silent passengers stared from windows as though watching us from beyond our own time. If this story unsettled you, don't let it vanish like so many rumors lost in the archives. Share it with someone who finds truth stranger than fiction, and perhaps together, you'll hear the echoes. Press like to help keep these hidden histories alive, and subscribe to Unseen Anthologies so you'll always know when the next forgotten tale is unearthed. Turn notifications on, because the next whistle in the night may not belong to any train you've ever known, but to the one that waits between yesterday and tomorrow.